From the private archives of the Blackwood estate, within a leather-bound diary whose pages smelled of pressed lavender and time itself, the story of Eleanor Vance was recovered, not as a footnote in the annals of the aristocracy, but as the quiet, unshakable epicenter of its most dramatic season. The air in the Blackwood ballroom was a gilded cage, thick with the scent of beeswax, hothouse lilies, and the cloying perfume of ambition. For Eleanor Vance, it was simply a cage. She stood beside her fiancé, Viscount Finch, a man whose smile was as polished and as hollow as the porcelain vases dotting the corridors. Her dress, a modest silk of dove gray, was a whisper in a room of shouted jewel tones, a deliberate choice to render herself invisible. It was a state she had cultivated for years, a form of self-preservation in a world that valued veneer over substance. She was, by society's cruel metrics, plain. Her features were too serene, her eyes too thoughtful, her dowry too small to be of any real consequence. She was merely a stepping stone for the Viscount, a necessary but regrettable acquisition. She felt his hand on the small of her back, a proprietary touch that sent a chill through the fine silk. He was guiding her towards the terrace, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "My dear, a moment of air. The heat is becoming quite oppressive, is it not?" It was not the heat he sought to escape, but the prying eyes of his creditors, men whose gazes followed him like patient vultures. Eleanor knew the truth of their situation. Viscount Finch was a man drowning in debt, and her dowry was the last fragile piece of driftwood to which he clung. He saw her not as a partner, but as a purse. The night air was cool, a welcome balm against her skin. It carried the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine from the Duke of Blackwood's famously melancholic gardens. Finch led her towards a secluded alcove, shadowed by a weeping willow, whose tendrils brushed the stone balustrade like ghostly fingers. He believed her to be naive, a quiet little mouse content with her lot. He had never once looked into her eyes and seen the sharp, assessing intelligence that watched his every move, that catalogued his every lie. "I must speak with Lord Harrington," he said, his tone feigning reluctance. "A matter of some urgency regarding my stables. Do wait here for me, my love. I shall not be a moment." He pressed a cold, brief kiss to her gloved hand and disappeared back into the glittering maw of the ballroom. She did not mind the solitude. It was a relief. Here, in the quiet dark, she could breathe. The music from within was a muted heartbeat, a world away from her silent contemplation. She traced the pattern of lichen on the cold stone, finding more life and honesty in its intricate design than in any conversation she had endured that evening. She was not meant for this life of performance and artifice. Her heart longed for the country, for the solidity of earth under her fingers, for the simple truth of a seed pushing its way towards the sun, a truth utterly absent in the man she was to marry. It was then that she heard the voices, drifting from the other side of a thick hedgerow of yew. One was Finch's, stripped of its public charm and sharpened with a cynical edge. The other belonged to Lord Harrington, a man known for his gossiping tongue and predatory investments. "You are a fortunate man, Finch," Harrington was saying, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "To secure the Vance girl. Her dowry will keep the wolves from your door for another season, at least." "A season is all I require," Finch replied, and the casual cruelty in his tone was a physical blow. "She is a temporary measure, a poultice for a mortal wound. Once her funds are transferred and my affairs are settled, I shall set my sights on a real prize. Lady Beatrice, perhaps. Her father's shipping fortune would float a navy." Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over the cold stone. Every muscle in her body went taut, a lute string pulled to its breaking point. Harrington chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "But what of the little mouse? You will be shackled. Divorce is a ruinous scandal." "Oh, she will be manageable," Finch said with a dismissive wave she could hear in his voice. "She is plain, quiet, grateful for the attention. She will be content to rusticate at one of my more remote estates while I enjoy the fruits of a more advantageous union. She knows her place. Women like her always do. A winter of my own making. The thought was a shard of ice in her mind. All this time she had believed her quiet compliance was a shield. She saw now that he had interpreted it as weakness, as an invitation for contempt. The humiliation was a hot, searing thing, a brand on her very soul. It was not the insult to her appearance that wounded her most deeply. It was the utter negation of her personhood. She was not a woman to him, but an asset to be liquidated. She did not cry. The tears froze in her throat, turning to a hard, cold knot of resolve. For years she had endured, had made herself small to survive. No more. The cage, she realized, had never been locked. She had simply been sitting in it with the door wide open. She stepped out from the alcove, her dove-gray dress seeming to absorb the moonlight, turning it to silver. She moved with a grace born not of training, but of absolute certainty. When Finch and Harrington rounded the yew hedge, they stopped short, their smirks dissolving into slack-jawed shock. Eleanora's gaze was fixed solely on Finch. Her expression was not one of rage or hysteria, but of a calm, glacial serenity that was far more terrifying. She met his panicked eyes and held them. "Viscount," she said, her voice perfectly level, carrying with crystalline clarity in the still night air. "I find I must disagree with your assessment." Finch sputtered, his face a mottled canvas of red and white. "Eleanora, my dear, you misunderstand. We were jesting." "Were you jesting about my dowry being a temporary measure?" she asked, taking a slow, deliberate step towards him. "Or about my rustication to a remote estate? Or was the jest, perhaps, my supposed gratitude for your attention?" Each question was a silken blade slicing through his blustering facade. She stopped directly before him and slowly, methodically, pulled the sapphire engagement ring from her finger. It was his mother's, the only thing of value he still possessed. It felt cold and foreign against her skin. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. "As does the entirety of your character. I find I have no use for either." She did not hand it to him. She simply opened her fingers and let it fall. The ring struck the stone flags with a small, sharp clink, a sound that seemed to echo with the finality of a death knell. Then she turned her back on him. She walked away, not with haste, but with the regal composure of a queen abdicating a worthless throne. She did not look back. She felt his fury radiating behind her, a palpable, suffocating heat. Just as she reached the edge of the terrace steps, his hand shot out, his fingers biting into her arm like a vice. "You will not humiliate me," he hissed, his face contorted with a vicious rage she had never seen but had always sensed simmering beneath the surface. "You are nothing without me." A shadow detached itself from the upper balcony. It moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving. One moment, there was nothing but the moonlight on the stone arches above. The next, a tall, imposing figure stood at the top of the steps. He was dressed in unforgiving black, the severity of his attire making him seem carved from the night itself. It was the Duke of Blackwood, Alaric St. Vincent, a man spoken of only in whispers, the Iron Duke, a recluse who had not been seen at his own gatherings for years, preferring to haunt the edges of his own life like a phantom. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone sucked the very air from the space around him. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on Finch's hand, gripping Eleanora's arm. "Release her," he said. The words were not a request. They were a command, delivered in a low, resonant tone that brooked no argument. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience, a voice that had likely commanded armies and decided the fates of nations. Finch, coward that he was, flinched as if struck. His hand dropped from Eleanor's arm as if her skin had suddenly turned to hot iron. He stared up at the Duke, his mouth opening and closing with no sound emerging. The Duke descended the few remaining steps, his gaze never leaving Finch. He moved with a predatory grace that was utterly mesmerizing. He stopped beside Eleanora, positioning himself as a formidable barrier between her and her former fiancé. He did not look at her, yet she felt the full weight of his attention, a silent, powerful current. "The lady wishes to leave," the Duke stated, his eyes still locked on the Viscount. "You will not impede her." "Your Grace," Finch stammered, finally finding his voice. "This is a private matter, a misunderstanding between myself and my fiancé." The Duke's lips thinned into a line of utter contempt. "She does not appear to be your fiancé any longer, and you have made it my business by accosting a guest on my property." He paused, letting the silence stretch into an uncomfortable eternity. "Leave. Now." Finch, utterly defeated, cast one last venomous look at Eleanora before turning and practically fleeing back into the ballroom, disappearing into the light and noise like the craven insect he was. Only then did the Duke turn his attention to her. For the first time, Eleanora saw him clearly. He was not handsome in the conventional, charming way of men like Finch. His face was all harsh angles and stark planes, a face shaped by grief or hardship, dominated by those unnervingly perceptive eyes. There were lines of silver at his temples that spoke of a burden carried for too long. He hadn't blinked since she first walked into the ballroom hours ago. She realized now he had been watching, not just her, but everything. Her arm throbbed where Finch had gripped it. A tremor she had suppressed now ran through her, a delayed reaction to the shock and the confrontation. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to still the shaking. The Duke's severe expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "You are cold, Miss Vance." He shrugged off his own formal black coat, the wool still warm from his body, and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling faintly of old books, cedar, and the cold night air. The gesture was so unexpected, so shockingly intimate, that it stole her breath. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "The library will be warmer, and you will be safe there." He did not offer his arm, a gesture she realized would have been too presumptuous, too much like the society men he clearly despised. Instead, he simply began to walk towards a side door hidden behind a curtain of ivy, trusting she would follow. She did. The weight of his coat was a comfort, a shield against the world and the winter that had just been unleashed inside her. For the first time all night, she did not feel alone. The library at Blackwood Manor was not merely a room. It was a sanctuary, a cathedral dedicated to the written word. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark, polished mahogany groaned under the weight of countless leather-bound volumes. The air was still and reverent, scented with the holy trinity of old paper, lemon oil, and fireplace smoke. A massive hearth dominated one wall, a fire already crackling merrily within its stone maw, casting flickering shadows that danced across the spines of books and the worn velvet of the armchairs. A globe stood in one corner, its contents faded by time, and a massive oak desk was littered with star charts and what looked like architectural drawings. It was a room that reflected its owner completely, serious, ancient, and filled with secrets. The Duke gestured towards one of the armchairs near the fire. "Please," he said, the word feeling less like a polite invitation and more like a gentle edict. He moved to a small table where a crystal decanter of brandy sat, its amber liquid glowing in the firelight. He poured a small amount into 2 glasses without asking, seeming to know instinctively that she needed it. He handed one to her, his long, artist-like fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. The contact sent a strange warmth through her, a startling contrast to the icy dread that had gripped her on the terrace. He took the opposite chair, the fine wool of his waistcoat stark against the crisp white of his shirt. He did not drink, but simply held the glass, watching the light play through the liquid as he watched her. The silence was not awkward. It was thoughtful, a space for her to gather the shattered pieces of her composure. "I was on the balcony," he said at last, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the books around them. "I heard everything." Eleanor's head snapped up. A fresh wave of shame washed over her. To have her deepest humiliation witnessed by this formidable, enigmatic man was an agony of a different sort. She looked down into her glass, unable to meet his gaze. "Then you know what a fool I have been, Your Grace." "No," he replied, his tone firm, devoid of pity. "I know that you have been patient. I know that you have been dignified in the face of profound disrespect. And I know that you possess a strength of character that Viscount Finch could never comprehend, let alone deserve." He took a small sip of his brandy. "I have been aware of the Viscount's financial precariousness for some time. I suspected he was a man of weak moral fiber. Tonight, you proved it." His words were a balm to her wounded pride. He did not see her as a victim, a jilted, plain woman. He saw her as he had seen the situation, clearly and without sentiment. She took a tentative sip of the brandy. The fiery liquid slid down her throat, chasing away the last of the chill and steadying her nerves. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you concern yourself with my affairs, Your Grace?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. The flames cast shadows across his harsh features, softening them, revealing a deep-seated melancholy she had not seen before. "Because," he began slowly, "I know what it is to be trapped in a gilded cage, though my bars were of my own making." He rose from his chair and walked over to a set of tall, mullioned windows that overlooked a walled section of the garden. He stared out into the darkness, his back to her. "My wife, my first Duchess, died 10 years ago," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion, as if recounting a historical fact rather than a personal tragedy. "A carriage accident. It was a beautiful spring day. The sun was shining. She was on her way to visit her sister, and then she was gone." He paused. "After that, the light and noise of the world became intolerable. The meaningless chatter, the false smiles, the endless social obligations. They were like grinding glass in a fresh wound. So I locked the doors. I retreated into these books, into my work. I became the phantom of Blackwood Manor. It was easier than feeling." Eleanor listened, her heart aching with a sudden, unexpected empathy. She understood. Oh, how she understood. Her own retreat into quiet invisibility had been its own form of mourning. A mourning for the life of affection and partnership she had always craved, but never found. "I am so sorry," she breathed. The words felt inadequate, flimsy things in the face of such profound, enduring grief. He turned from the window, and for a moment, the mask of the Iron Duke was gone. In its place was the face of a man who was deeply, terribly lonely. "The world sees me as cold, severe. Perhaps I am. Grief can temper a man into something hard, but it also makes him observant. I have learned to watch from the shadows. I see things others miss." He gestured vaguely back towards the ballroom, the muffled sounds of which could barely be heard through the thick oak doors. I see the desperation behind the jewels, the fear behind the laughter. And I saw you. His gaze met hers across the room, and it was intense, unwavering. I have seen you at a dozen such events over the past year. You never engage in gossip. You are kind to the servants. You listen more than you speak. You carry yourself with a quiet grace that is more captivating than any manufactured beauty. I saw a woman of immense substance being treated as a shadow. His voice was low, almost a confession. Tonight, on that terrace, I did not see a victim. I saw a lioness, finally showing her teeth. He walked to a small glass-enclosed case in a corner of the library that she hadn't noticed before. It was a miniature conservatory, a terrarium filled with lush, exotic-looking plants. From within, he carefully lifted a single pot containing a flower of the most breathtaking and unusual beauty. It was an orchid, its petals the color of midnight velvet, with delicate, silvery veins that shimmered in the firelight. "This is a Paphiopedilum Rothschildianum," he said, his voice softening with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. "The gold of Kinabalu orchid. It is notoriously difficult to cultivate. It requires precise conditions, a delicate balance of light and shadow, humidity and air. It can take years to bloom. Most gardeners give up." He brought it over and set it on the table between them. She leaned forward, mesmerized by its intricate, alien beauty. It was not a pretty flower, not like a rose or a lily. It was strange, complex, and utterly magnificent. "It is a survivor," he continued, his eyes fixed on the bloom. "It thrives where other, more flamboyant flowers would wither. Its beauty is not simple or obvious. It is earned." He finally lifted his gaze from the orchid to her. "It reminds me of you, Miss Vance." The breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said anything so profound, so deeply understanding to her in her entire life. He saw her. He truly saw her, not as the plain Miss Vance, not as a little mouse, but as something rare and resilient and beautiful in her own right. A tear, the one she had refused to shed on the terrace, finally escaped and traced a single hot path down her cheek. He made no move to wipe it away, affording her the dignity of her own emotion. He simply stood there, a silent guardian in his magnificent library, offering her a sanctuary not just from the world, but from her own loneliness. The heavy wool of his coat was still wrapped around her shoulders, a tangible symbol of his protection. In the warm, firelit silence of that room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 stories, a new one was beginning to be written. The days that followed the Blackwood Ball were a trial by fire. As Eleanor had anticipated, Viscount Finch, his vanity wounded and his financial desperation at a fever pitch, did not go quietly. He could not attack the Duke of Blackwood directly. That would be social suicide. So he turned the full force of his venom on her. Whispers followed her like a foul miasma wherever she went. She was an unstable hysteric, they murmured over their teacups. She was an ungrateful creature who had thrown the Viscount's devotion back in his face. The most vicious rumor, and the one that gained the most traction, was that she had attempted to entrap the reclusive Duke, throwing herself at him in a desperate, pathetic bid for a grander title. Her own family, distant cousins who had been happy to have her off their hands, offered no support. They saw only the loss of a viscountcy, not the salvation of her soul. She was isolated, a pariah in the very society that had once merely ignored her. Yet, something within her had irrevocably shifted that night in the Duke's library. The whispers were bothersome, like the buzzing of flies, but they could not penetrate the new armor of self-worth she had begun to forge. She held her head high, met the cruel glances with a calm she did not always feel. and endured. The true architect of her social crucifixion, however, was a far more formidable foe. The Dowager Duchess, Alaric's own mother, was a woman carved from glacial ice. She had long disapproved of her son's reclusiveness, seeing it as an abdication of his social duties. When news of his intervention on behalf of a nondescript little nobody reached her, she saw not an act of chivalry, but a threat. She envisioned this plain, titleless girl somehow snaring her son, the most eligible and powerful duke in the kingdom, and she would not stand for it. She lent her considerable social weight to the rumors, giving them the stamp of aristocratic credibility. At a luncheon hosted by Lady Danbury, the Dowager had cut Eleanora dead, looking through her as if she were made of glass. It was a public execution, and society, ever eager for blood, sharpened its knives. Eleanora had retreated to her modest rented rooms, the weight of it all finally pressing down on her. Her loyal maid, Agnes, wrung her hands with worry. "It is not right, miss," she'd said, her eyes flashing with anger. "They are vipers, the lot of them." A package had arrived that afternoon. It was delivered by a footman in the Blackwood livery. There was no note. Inside, nestled in a bed of moss, was another orchid. This one a delicate white with a dusting of pink at its center, as if it were blushing. It was a silent message of support, a reminder of that quiet moment of understanding in the library. It was a lifeline. 2 days later, the Duke himself called upon her. It was unheard of. Dukes did not call on unmarried ladies of no particular standing in their rented rooms. His gleaming black carriage with its ducal crest caused a sensation on her quiet street. He was shown into her small, respectable sitting room, and his large frame seemed to fill the entire space, making her familiar furnishings look like dollhouse furniture. He came straight to the point, dispensing with pleasantries. "I am aware of the campaign being waged against you," he said, his voice tight with a controlled fury. "It is orchestrated by Finch and amplified by my mother. I will not allow it." Eleanora sat opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap. "Your Grace, you have already done more than enough. This is my battle to fight." "No," he said, his stormy eyes locking with hers. "It is ours. An attack on you now is an attack on my judgment, and I do not suffer my judgment to be questioned." He placed a heavy leather portfolio on the small table between them. He tapped it once with a long finger. "For the past week, my solicitors have been busy. I have methodically and quietly purchased every single one of Viscount Finch's debts, from his tailor to his wine merchant to the gambling dens that hold his markers. I own him. Every shilling, every acre, every last breath of his miserable existence is now owed to me." She stared at the portfolio, stunned into silence. This was not a simple act of defense. This was total, systematic annihilation. He had not just built a shield around her, he had dismantled the enemy's entire army, piece by piece, without a single shot being fired in public. It was ruthless, strategic, and utterly breathtaking. "He will no longer be a problem," the Duke stated, a chilling finality in his voice. "As for my mother, she will learn that her influence has its limits, especially where I am concerned." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity drawing all the air from the room. "But this is only a temporary solution, Miss Vance. They have attacked your reputation. The only way to permanently silence them, to restore your honor in the eyes of this wretched society, is to give you a name so powerful, a position so unassailable, that not even a dowager duchess would dare to whisper against it." Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against its cage. She knew what he was about to say, yet it seemed impossible. a fantasy spun from firelight and brandy. "I am not a man for poetry, Eleonora," he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both a shock and a homecoming. "I will not speak of love, for I am a man who is still learning what that word means again. I offer you what I have: my name, my protection, my loyalty. I offer you a partnership, a fortress within which you may be safe, and from which we may face the world together, as equals." It was the most unconventional, unromantic, and yet deeply moving proposal she could have ever imagined. He was not offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a sword and shield. He was offering her respect. "Marry me, Eleonora," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Become the Duchess of Blackwood, and let us show them all what true power looks like." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or humiliation. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She had been invisible for so long, and now this man, this powerful, broken, and beautiful man, saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. She met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel the need to hide. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alaric, I will." The Danbury Masquerade was the crowning jewel of the social season, a night of calculated anonymity where secrets were currency and reputations could be made or shattered behind the guise of a velvet mask. It was the perfect stage for a reckoning. When the Duke of Blackwood and Eleanora Vance were announced, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. They wore no masks. Their arrival was not an entrance. It was a declaration of war. Alaric was a figure of formidable power in his severe black evening wear, a stark pillar of darkness in the glittering ballroom. But it was Eleonora who drew every eye. She was not the same woman who had hidden in a dove-gray dress. Tonight, she wore a gown of deep sapphire velvet, the exact color of the ring she had discarded on the terrace. The cut was elegant, simple, yet it clung to her form with a confidence that was entirely new. Her hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck, and around her throat lay the Blackwood diamonds, a river of cold, brilliant fire that dared anyone to question her place. She was not beautiful in the dazzling, vapid way of Lady Beatrice. She was magnificent. Her serenity had been forged into a regal calm, her intelligence now a sharp, visible weapon in her eyes. They moved through the room as one, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. Whispers followed in their wake, a hiss of shock and disbelief. They stopped near the grand staircase, a deliberate move to hold the center of the room, to be seen. It was there that the Dowager Duchess, her face a mask of pure fury, intercepted them. She was flanked by her coterie of sycophants, her own small army of social tyrants. "Alaric," she said, her voice like the crack of a whip, "what is the meaning of this spectacle? You cannot possibly be entertaining the notion of aligning yourself with this person." Her eyes raked over Eleonora with undisguised contempt. "She's plain," his mother insisted, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant to slice Eleonora to the bone. "She has no name, no connections. She will be your ruin." Alaric did not even glance at his mother. His gaze, which had not blinked since Eleonora entered his life, remained fixed on her face, his expression one of profound admiration. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "On the contrary, mother," he replied, his voice calm and carrying for all to hear. "She is the only thing I have seen clearly in a decade." He took Eleonora's hand and lifted it to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "I would be ruined without her." The public display of affection, so out of character for the Iron Duke, was more shocking than a slap in the face. The dowager recoiled, speechless for the first time in her life. It was then that Viscount Finch, emboldened by desperation and wine, pushed his way through the crowd. His face was flushed, his eyes wild. He had clearly just learned of his financial demise. "Your Grace," he cried, his voice cracking, "you cannot do this. It is dishonorable. You have destroyed me." Alaric turned his head slowly, fixing Finch with a look of such glacial indifference that the Viscount physically stumbled back. "Honor?" the Duke repeated, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. "You will lecture me on honor? A man who would barter his fiancée for a shipping fortune and leave her to wither in obscurity? You destroyed yourself, Finch. I merely collected the receipts." From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward. It was Mr. Davies, Alaric's solicitor, a man with a face as dry and dispassionate as the legal documents he carried. He presented the heavy leather portfolio to Finch. "The foreclosure notices, my lord," Mr. Davies said, his tone flat. "All of your properties, including your London residence and Finchley Park, are now the property of the Duke of Blackwood, in lieu of your outstanding debts. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises." Finch stared at the documents, his face crumbling. The public nature of his ruin was complete. He was not just bankrupt. He was a social leper, exposed and cast out. He looked from the papers to Alaric, and finally, his desperate, pleading eyes fell on Eleonora. "Eleonora, please," he whimpered. "You cannot let him do this." Eleonora felt a flicker of the old pity, the instinct to smooth things over, to make herself small. She extinguished it without a second thought. That woman was gone, left behind on a cold stone terrace. She stepped forward, her sapphire gown rustling softly. She was not addressing Finch the man, but the ghost of her own fear. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the ballroom with devastating precision. "You once told a friend you were setting your sights on a fortune, my lord," she said, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering. "It seems you have found only the price of your own character." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It appears the cost was quite high. A final, perfect blow." It was not delivered with anger, but with the quiet finality of a closing ledger. A murmur went through the crowd, not of pity for Finch, but of dawning respect for the woman who stood before them. She had not been rescued. She had been armed, and she had just won her own war. Without another word, Alaric placed her hand on his arm. They turned their backs on the dowager's fury and the Viscount's utter ruin, and walked away, leaving the wreckage of their old lives behind them. As they ascended the grand staircase, leaving the gasping, whispering world below, Eleonora knew she was not just ascending to a higher floor. She was ascending to a new life, a life where she would never be invisible again. They did not stay in London. The city, with its poisoned whispers and social machinations, held nothing for them. The day after the masquerade, they were married in a quiet ceremony at the Duke's London residence, with only his loyal housekeeper, Mr. Davies, and Eleonora's maid Agnes as witnesses. There was no grand spectacle, no feast, no fawning crowds. There was only the quiet, solemn exchange of vows, a promise of partnership that felt more real and binding than any public declaration. Immediately after, they retreated. They journeyed north to the heart of his domain, Blackwood Manor. The estate was like its master, vast, imposing, and steeped in a melancholy beauty. It was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of gray stone and leaded glass, set amidst hundreds of acres of ancient forest and rolling hills. For a decade, it had been a place of hibernation, of managed decline, kept orderly by the formidable Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, but lacking a true soul. It was a house holding its breath, waiting. Their first evening there, Alaric led her back to the library. The fire was lit, the brandy was poured, and the midnight orchid stood on the table between their chairs, a silent sentinel to their journey. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, the culmination of weeks of turmoil and revelation. Alaric set his glass aside, untouched. He rose and came to stand before her chair, looking down at her with an expression of raw vulnerability that she had only glimpsed before. The Iron Duke was gone. In his place was simply Alaric, a man afraid and hopeful in equal measure. "Eleonora," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I offered you a fortress, a name, protection. I offered you everything but the one thing you deserved most, because I was not certain I still possessed it." He knelt before her, a gesture of such profound humility from this powerful man that it made her heart ache. He took both of her hands in his. "That night on the terrace, I saw you choose to save yourself. You did not need a rescuer. And in the library, I saw a woman whose quiet strength mirrored the beauty of the rarest flower. And in your sitting room, I saw the partner I never knew I was searching for." He looked into her eyes, and the winter storms in his had finally broken, revealing a depth of feeling that left her breathless. "I am in love with you, Eleonora. It is a terrifying and wondrous thing to feel the sun again after a decade of winter. I love your intelligence, your resilience, your quiet, unshakable dignity. I love you." Tears streamed freely down her face now, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She brought his hands to her lips, kissing his knuckles. "And I love you, Alaric," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw me when I believed I was invisible. You gave me a shield, but more than that, you showed me my own sword." He leaned in then, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, reverent discovery. It was a kiss that tasted of brandy and wood smoke, and 10 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of quiet evenings by the fire, of a partnership forged in adversity and sealed in a sanctuary of old books and blossoming hope. It was the sealing of their bond, the true beginning of their life together. The following months passed in a blur of peaceful industry. An epilogue of happiness began to write itself into the history of Blackwood Manor. News from London was a distant echo. Viscount Finch, stripped of everything, had fled to the continent to escape debtor's prison, a pathetic footnote in a story that had moved on without him. The Dowager Duchess, her social power broken by her son's public defiance, had retreated to a remote dower house, her reign of terror finally over. Eleonora, the new Duchess of Blackwood, found her purpose not in hosting glittering balls, but in the soil of the estate. The famous gardens, particularly a walled rose garden that had been his first wife's pride, had been left to grow wild, a beautiful but sorrowful testament to Alaric's grief. With a gentle hand and a keen intellect, Eleonora began to bring it back to life. She did not rip out the wildness, but worked with it, pruning and tending, nurturing the old, forgotten blooms and planting new, hardy varietals alongside them. It became a metaphor for their life together, honoring the past but cultivating a vibrant, resilient future. Alaric worked alongside her. The formidable Duke, who had once moved markets and crushed enemies with a stroke of a pen, now found contentment in hauling bags of soil and discussing the finer points of rose cultivation. The servants, who had only ever known their master as a stern, silent phantom, watched in amazement as laughter returned to the halls of Blackwood. He was softened, not weakened. The harsh lines of his face were gentled by a constant, quiet smile reserved only for his wife. He was no longer living in a self-imposed winter. Eleonora was his spring, his summer, his sun. She had not just restored his garden, she had restored him. Theirs was a union of equals, a shared reign over a kingdom of quiet contentment and profound, enduring love. They had arrived here, in this life together, like a ring finally set down upon the right finger.